Hello, I'm Linda from Linda Milky Quilts, Miss Linda Milky Quilts, and I've started a new project. On the wall behind me, you could see a whole pile of squares, and they went together very quickly. And you can also see they are going to be quilt as you go. Quilt as you go is one of my favorite ways to use up a variety of pieces of fabric that are leftovers from other projects. Maybe some of my projects, maybe somebody else's projects, but I tend to use Quilt as you go as a go to because it is fast, it's economical, and it uses so many leftover pieces, and you can vary it all you want, and it still is going to make a nice warm quilt. So, when I was making my Caribbean project, I had a big bucket of fabric that I was pulling from to select the colors for the items that I was making. And so I have this big bucket of leftover pieces. Some I didn't use, some I did use, and they're smaller pieces than they were before. But I always try to use the things that I've got on my desk when they're out of the closet, and then I can make sure that the projects that I am making, I know how much fabric I have, and I know what types of things that I would like to do. So, what I try to do is utilize the things that are at hand. It's faster, it's easier. I don't have to go pick and pull from my cupboard. And that's the way I like it. So, I started pulling things out of the bucket again, and I picked out all the blues. I have a lot of blues in that bucket because the Caribbean had the sky, the surf, the water, some of the houses were blue, and there was a lot of blue. And I had big sections of blue. But I also had more in my bucket that I needed. So today I thought I'm going to just make something else blue. And there it is. But Quilt As You Go is wonderful because I could cut smaller pieces for the backings as well. The backing is not one big backing for the whole quilt, it's each of those squares has its own backing. And so I can piece those backings as well. It uses up lots and lots of smaller pieces, not tiny little pieces or crumbs, but smaller pieces that don't really go very far in a mainstream quilt. So here's the back side of some of the pieces that I've got on the wall. So the first thing that I did was I cut rectangles. And I thought I would cut rectangles because I wanted to make a grid, quilt as you go, and I wanted to make so many squares to give enough length for the bed and enough width for a single bed. And if I wanted to, I could add another row across the top there, and then it would be a double size bed. Because I made these blocks so that each of these sections is about 7.5 inches. So when it's sewn together and then I get the borders on it or the sashings on it, it's going to be a 14-inch width. And I made sure that I had a 16-inch length. And you see, I just cut one piece of batting for the back. From my leftover batting, I have a dear friend who is a long armor, and often she will give me the cutoffs from the long arming process. When a quilt is not as wide as the fabric batting is, you have to cut some off. And she often will give me bags full of the leftover cutoffs, which is very handy for making quilt as you go. So I went through my bin of all the fabric scraps from the Caribbean project that I just finished. And I thought blue by itself was a little bit not enough. So I went to another bin that I have, grays or white with gray or dark gray, and I added a half of the uh, block is in a gray tone, and half of the block is in a blue tone. And I cut a binding. No, sorry. I cut a backing out of the blues and batting from the scraps. So on the wall, I have a backing, a batting, and one square to put together, pressed, and I can just quilt them now in a grid or straight line quilting, and then sash between them, and I have a quilt. And if I took the time to measure the amount of time that it took me to make this today, it would be about 2.5 hours, because all I did was cut rectangles, very easy. All I did was cut squares, and if my squares of batting were not quite big enough, I seamed them together with an adhesive, and then I cut a backing. And if the backing wasn't not quite big enough, I added a piece to the side. That really didn't take very long. But when I look at it, it's a little bit bland. So I could quilt it with a colored thread. I could put the sashing on in a complementary color like orange. You might see a little bit of orange right here, left over from my Caribbean project. And I could add another detail. So what I did was went to my 10.5 inch square cut squares. And whenever I have a project finished, I will cut whatever is left over into squares. And I make the biggest squares first. And see all the things that I've got big squares? I've got bigger squares. And I've got some bigger squares. And then, of course, I have my buckets of all sizes stored here, and they are ready to make a quilt at any time. So anyway, I took some of these 10-inch squares and I cut it in half. And then I took another one, cut in half, sewed it together again, just like I did with these. Those were 16 inches that way and 7 inches this way, and that made 14 inches when it was sewed together. But these are 10 inches, and I cut them in half, so these are 5.25, and no, these are 5. And so I sewed 2 of these together, and I got a lot of small squares like these small squares. Now they're very colorful, and the reason I wanted them to be colorful is to put them on top of those quite bland colors, blue and gray, and give it some interest, I guess. So what I did with that is I went upstairs to my kitchen and I got one of my bowls, my soup bowls. I took one of my soup bowls, and then I took a marker and I draw around the edge of the soup bowl. So I have a nice circle. And then what I did, some bias tape. I took that to the iron and folded it in half crosswise, pressed it, and presto, sewed it around on the line that I drew, and then I pressed all those seams underneath, giving me a circle. And I'm going to sew this onto the blocks on the wall. One circle for every block. And so I've got orange with gray and lots of color. You can see the colors I have for these circles. And I think I'll try to make the bias tape for all of them in an orangey color to stand out proudly against the blue and gray backgrounds. Now I can quilt these on, or just applique these on the top, and as I quilt the whole block, it will be incorporated in the block. So that's my plan. I haven't really put any on yet, and I haven't done any Quilt As You Go yet. So I'm just now making these circles and putting the bias tape on. So I'll just demonstrate how I put that on. So here's a square, one of my blocks, and I just press them with the iron so that the fabric tends to adhere to the backing and the batting. I place it underneath the presser foot with a walking foot on my sewing machine. I have a spacer bar, but I'll show you how I use that. So the first line of stitching that I put on this rectangle is going to be a straight line along one of the short edges. One end to the other. Then what I'm going to do is turn this block around, and now I'm going to use that spacer bar along here, and that will give me my length or the width of the 2 rows of stitching, and I will continue that all the way down until I get to the other end. So I don't really have to show you every row of stitching. I'm going to speed this up and just imagine that you have watched me sew all of these lines of stitching across the top of this block. One of the easiest ways to quilt a block. Straight line, parallel lines. So there I am. I've sped the tape up so that you can see how it looks as it goes through the machine. I tend to just use straight line stitching quite a bit. If I want to do a grid pattern, like a diagonal, I start at 1/4 and do a 45, and then I go all across using the same spacing, and then turn it 45 degrees and then go the other way. But quilting a small block like this size is very easy to do. And when you join them up with Quilt As You Go, It makes a quilt very quickly put together. I just love having the ability to make these small quilts. So this block now is quilted. I'm going to take it to my cutting desk and trim off the edges and make it the size that I want the finished block. So here's the block on my grid, and what I do, I line up the center line with a number like 20 on my cutting mat. I go across 7 inches and trim off the end. Then I turn it around, match up the center line again with the 20 on here, go across 7 inches and cut it off. I always tend to make my blocks just a slight amount bigger than I want the finished size, because they do lose width or length when they get quilted. They get puffy, so they lose width. And I want to have my finished blocks the correct size. Then I put my block on a straight line, and I will cut off, keeping the ruler line here on the halfway mark, and I will cut off one end. Then I will place the other one on a line and across here, and I will cut off the mark that I want to cut off. And in this case, it's 16.5 inches. Always tend to use the gridded ruler cutting mat for cutting my big blocks. That's the easiest way to keep things perpendicular, keep the lines straight, and get the correct size that you want. All right, so there is my block trimmed to the size that I wanted. Now it's time to make the circle. Here's the piece of fabric I'm going to use for my circle. Here's my soup bowl, and I place the soup bowl on top of my 10-inch square here. It's basically a 10-inch square. I found that using the marker sometimes doesn't show up very well on the darker fabrics, so I've resorted to some tailor's chalk, and it makes an easy line to follow. I could see that, and I have different colors of this chalk if I need to, and I can revert to the marker if I want to. So there's all kinds of ways to mark the circle. Whether you can see that or not, I do have a circle on there, but I don't cut it off right away. The next thing that I want to do is to take the bias tape that I've cut from orange, and what I do is I cut one end square, but I don't tend to go and iron these in half right away. I tend to want to have a loose bit on the top. I find it easier that way. And I will start just by keeping the raw edge of my bias tape, the two pieces of bias tape, and put it to the line that I've just drawn. I just put the edge on the line that I have just drawn. Now what I'm going to do is go to my sewing machine and stitch this on so it goes around the circle. So I keep the raw edges on the edge of the line that I have drawn. Just a reminder, I cut my bias strips 1 1/4 inches wide, and I fold them in half, but I don't like to press them. I just keep them open so I can test and make sure that I'm not stretching. So I smooth my finger out on the bottom part of the bias tape, and then I just fold over the top so that the raw edges meet. And as long as I take my time and just don't pull or stretch the bias tape, keep it nice and even, it just seems to fold in place. And I just stitch around until I get to where I started. Now my bias tape has lots of seams in it, and when I come to a seam, I just finger press it open and fold over the bias tape so that the result will be smooth and even. But my piece of bias tape is too short. I have to add another piece. Uh-oh. Just add another piece. When you want to add bias tape to bias tape, the edge is usually a 45. And the piece you want to put on there is a 45. Here we go, this piece is a 45. And they should match up like that when they're sewn. But you place them right sides together. And it will be on an angle. Easily sewn on an angle with a little bit of the bottom sticking out at a point here, add a bit of the top, sticking out there. So the seam goes from the edge to the edge. Now I can just continue sewing this on around the curve. Finger press the new seam that I just made. Keep the edge of the bias tape, raw edge of the bias tape on my chalk line. From my point of view, I could see the chalk line. From your point of view, you could see the stitching, I think. Now, when I get close to the other end, I'm going to make not a 45, just a 90-degree seam, because that's easier for me to do right here. So I stop a little bit short of where I'm going to make this seam. And here's that piece underneath. Oops. Here's this piece on top. And I'm going to sew them here. Take it off there. Just sew a straight seam across the two pieces. And when I open this out, put this back under the presser foot, I start back there again. I press this with my finger, so all I have to do is keep the two edges on the chalk line. And the curve just goes around to where I started sewing this circle. The next thing I need to do is just trim off the excess fabric on the outside of the circle and press it. Then I will quilt this on. So when I've pressed it, trimmed the inside and pressed it, the bias tape stretches around the outside perimeter, and that just folds in nicely all along the circle. Now I'm going to take my big circle, my big piece here, and I am going to place my circle on here, on the surface. I have been measuring from one end to the edge 1 1/2 inches, and I keep the diameter of the circle on the straight line of the block. One and a half. I place a pin here to keep that secure, and I place a pin at the other end to keep it securely attached to the diameter. And the only other thing that I measure when I do this is the center point. And between there and here is 9 inches, so 4 1/2 inches is my center point. right here. And because it's a circle, I think it's like pie. I'm going to just sew around the outside, come across the diameter, go across, and division it like a pie. Just one line of stitching and end up over here. And that will be quilted on. When I start, I hold the upper thread so that the bobbin thread comes to the surface, because I don't need to have things to trim off underneath. And I just do a straight stitch. Now I'm not using a walking foot here, so I have to be kind of careful that I don't have my presser down too securely. It floats. And all I'm doing is just sewing around the edge. It's another layer of quilting, but it doesn't take very long. Before I get to the starting point, I trim off those two threads. And needle down. I turn and go right across the diameter all the way to the edge, edge of the inner circle. And at the inner circle, I come around a quarter of the circumference, just like cutting a slice of pie. And I eyeball it and come straight across to the other side. Give it another turn, come around the circumference until I get to the halfway point. Another slice of pie right through the center point. I can take the pin out now because there's the center point. Oh, that's a skinny slice of pie. Around here, halfway point. Last segment of the pie. And I usually just sew around to the starting point on this side. Give it a little bit of a back stitch. And it's all sewn on. There's a little bit of thread at the back that I trim off from my needle threader, there, and that's sewn on. On to the next one. That didn't take very long. Putting them up on the wall and making sure that the colors flow nicely and that I have the tops and the bottoms of the rectangles light, dark, and making a nice pattern is the key thing for me now. I can move the blocks around. I can change the positions of the blocks if I want to, but I can't turn them upside down. If I turned them upside down, I would have to turn the whole row upside down so that I got continuity in the width of the space between the edge of the block and the circle. That's all. Now it's just, I'll finish all of these blocks and then quilt as you go. The Quilt As You Go refresher will be in a couple of weeks. I'll see you later. I hope you have enjoyed this video and I hope that you have found something interesting and useful. Thank you very much. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Thank you very much. Bye for now.